Maps aren't just a tool for navigation, they're powerful instruments for change. Today, we're exploring how GIS can transform climate action plans, making them more data driven, resilient, and effective. And guiding us through this conversation is Sunny Fleming, Director of Environment, Conservation, and Natural Resource Solutions at Esri Inc. From hurricanes to heat waves, we'll discuss how spatial data and technology are shaping the future of climate resilience and helping communities prepare for the challenges ahead. Let's dive in. Welcome back to Geographical Thinking. I'm Michelle Brake, and I'll be your guide as we explore ideas, stories, and conversations through the lens of geography. So thank you for joining me today, Sunny, and welcome to Geographical Thinking.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited. It's weirdly a topic I love to talk about, even though it can be so dismal. But it's a good one to talk about. We have action we can take.
Exactly. And then we get a bit of a hopeful spin on like we can have a change moving forward. So thinking about when it comes to the topic of climate change, how does this intersect with your career? Was it something that you studied? Was it just part of your work that fell into your lap, or something you've developed a passion for along the way?
A little bit of all three, I would say. So I certainly didn't study to be a climate scientist. That is not my background. No atmospheric classes whatsoever. My background is actually in botany and plant ecology. And so, formally in my college years, I certainly learned a lot about biogeography and how climatic conditions can change all sorts of things. But the climate component, you know, it was actually discussed when I was a public school student in Tennessee. Climate change was actually part of our curriculum.
Oh,
And
wow.
I remember learning about it at a very, very young age. And of course, at that time, too, the ozone layer and those kinds of topics were really big. And then you think about Al Gore. He was from Tennessee, a politician in Tennessee, and he had his big movie that I think was probably part of what tanked his political career, but it was super it made this amazing impression on me. And I just always had climate as a topic in the back of my mind throughout my whole life, really. Um, yeah, so it's a combination of things. And then I think some of the events that we're going to talk about today will kind of highlight how I've become so passionate about it in more recent years.
And I think it's a great point to highlight that it can be this thing that's always been there in the background of study, like having seen it in Convenient Truth at a young age. It's like, oh, this is a big topic. Like, how does that play a part in our daily lives? But I also remember, like, as a child, before recycling had its big moment of being reduce, reuse, recycle, I was like, you know what? We don't recycle at home. I'm going to take all of our paper to school and recycle it there. My parents are like, okay, I guess we got to get into this now. But like, you could have your little moments of being a climate change advocate at any age. But it's interesting to hear, yeah, how did this play a part? So thinking about how our lives have intersected through climate, I know we first met while I was living in Nashville for a few years. And this happened to coincide with a time where we had a tornado happen in 2020 that was a big deal for me as someone who comes from Eastern Canada, now living back in Eastern Canada. Tornadoes are a far thing from my mind. Hurricanes, sure. Tornadoes. I was like, wait, Nashville has these? I didn't think of that when I moved there. Uh, and I still have pictures. I still talk about it. I can still go find like my car that was destroyed on Google Maps images from like our old office.
Oh no.
Yep. It's like, no one else ever saw this car, so they don't know that it existed in my life. But like I did have this whole car that was like a thing. And it's weird
Yeah,
to have those moments.
absolutely. And I remember that 2020 tornado too, because I think it was about 2 weeks before we declared, a
Mhm.
global pandemic, right? Another climate change consequence. And it was like, oh, well, how do we clean up our city when we're supposed to be on lockdown? And that was such a bizarre and surreal time. Yeah, that tornado. Whew,
Yep.
that,
It was an interesting time. Like I remember I drove my car in its not great shape. It was a little in shambles to drop off so I could get a rental car because they had so many coming overnight for requests. Pick it up. Oh, okay, like, what am I gonna do? There's this possible pandemic coming, so I guess I'll just chill for a bit. I eventually flew home to Canada to be with family for a bit, but it's that unknown of, ooh, we're still trying to clean up. There's still so many things happening. It Our grocery stores were cleared out locally from power outages, and then there was these shortages that came up a few weeks later.
Oh yeah.
It was fun moments to recall now, but in the moment, like, there is already no toilet paper and food. How are we supposed to find the toilet paper and food?
There's definitely been these kind of punctuated moments recently where I think, you know, you're kind of in shock at how surreal something is. And the tornado and pandemic back to back was one of those moments. And then more recently, I had one of those moments, you know, of course, with Helene, and we're
Mhm.
still very much in recovery mode with Helene. But I was flying back just a couple weeks ago from DC, and we flew over the wildfires here. And I remember that weekend, you know, just being home and thinking, this is that other surreal moment. I don't know how to describe the feeling, but it's like you're a fly on the wall and you feel a little bit helpless and kind of in shock while the world spins around you. And but yeah, so it's those moments. They do exist. You know, I don't think anyone is impervious to feeling those things. I know most of the time my public personality is one of being super optimistic, and that is definitely a very real and genuine part of who I am. But I also want to make sure that people know that, you know, I'm a human too, right? And so I feel these feelings. I feel these feelings that others feel of feeling helpless and like they can't do anything. But you know, I snap out of them too. And I do have a privilege here at Esri, and you do as well, of seeing how people are taking action. And those stories are the things that keep me going day to day for sure.
And I think bringing up Helene, another interesting point where we've both had intersections. I know you live in Asheville, North Carolina, that was hit very hard by the hurricane. I happened to be on vacation in the Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina area during this time. So, like, the
Yeah.
world is spinning around us. And I was like, yeah, we're going to go on a trip. This is great. It's hurricane season, but we won't. Nothing will happen.
Beer City, USA, let's go.
Yep. We were like, oh, great. Like, we can go to Dollywood. Dollywood was canceled that day. And we're like, no thanks.
Oh,
But as those events were happening, we were constantly checking maps. It was, what are the highway maps looking like? What are weather maps looking like? How can we figure out a way to go around this? We're changing our plans. We need maps to figure it out. It's such a core element of emergency situations and needing to figure out plans. How did this play out for you? Because someone who lives in that area, I can only imagine it's a different reality than I'm on vacation. I just got to get out.
maps were definitely playing a critical role. My father is a big weather nerd. Like growing up, the Weather Channel was constantly playing on our TV. Like I kind of miss it. I don't know. It was always just playing on the TV. Dad was always watching it. And he has this little joke, and I grew up in Middle Tennessee. You know, I
Mhm.
live here in Asheville, North Carolina now, but in Middle Tennessee, we do have tornadoes all the time. And so we always had this joke. Anytime there was any kind of weather coming, my dad says it's going to get bad, and 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 so he was actually visiting during Helene,
Oh, wow.
and yeah, and so leading up to it, you know, that it kind of it precipitated pretty quickly. And so had he known that this massive historic hurricane was going to hit, he probably would have stayed home. But he was here, he was visiting, and we were doing our thing. I took him hiking. We and I start seeing news, you know, kind of in the periphery. You're not really paying attention to the news when you're hosting your parents and
Yeah.
your dad, and but I start seeing it in the periphery, and he's kind of paying attention too, because of course he's the weather nerd. And then the night that we decided to do our big dinner was that first band of rain that came in.
Mhm.
And the roads, we drove through Swannanoa to Black Mountain for dinner, and the roads were already flooded. And I remember being kind of freaked out. And, you know, my husband's like, oh, it's fine. We can go to dinner. And I was like, okay. And, you know, dad's trying to kind of stay calm too, but we're already talking about getting them out, you know. And so, yeah, the next morning, there's a little bit of a lull between that first band of rain and the hurricane. And we got dad out, we said our last jokes about, oh, it's going to get bad, but this time it was said with a little bit of nerves in the voice. And I would say, I think about 10 hours after dad drove over I-40 going home, it collapsed. And that's a very real moment. But maps throughout that time, of course, we're looking at maps. Dad's looking at his weather maps. We're looking at, the flooding and the road closures. The North Carolina DOT has like a real time setup where they can know ahead of time when the road is going to be overtopped and flooding. So that technology, their GIS technology, absolutely saved lives. Um, Maps played a critical role, but it was interesting too because we take maps for granted here at Esri, and I think in our lives generally.
Mm-hmm.
And after the hurricane hit and came through, there was this noticeable lack of public facing maps from our local governments. They were clearly very unprepared on kind of the public facing side of things. There's a lot of GIS going on behind the scenes. The emergency operations centers in the counties, 39 counties were involved in this, plus, of course, the state and federal government. There's a lot of GIS going on, but I think at the local level, they kind of did not take advantage of the public facing components that their GIS affords them. They weren't necessarily trained up on them. And meanwhile, across the border in Tennessee, they also got hit, right? Immediately, they had some public facing maps about water outages and the status of that. And my former colleague over there in Tennessee, Brian Ham, he and I actually just presented on this at Esri CIO Summit. And it's kind of a tale of two cities, right? What happens when you do have public facing maps and what happens when you don't have those public facing maps? And there's definitely a void of information that the public very quickly started to fill with their own concepts of these stories and their own rumors. And the misinformation that proliferated after Helene, because we didn't have those intuitive public facing resources, it continues to cause issues with our recovery to this day. And we're, I think, 7 months out now from the hurricane. So it's a big deal. And it's a technology that I think we take for granted and we need to pay more attention to on the public facing side, especially.
I think it's interesting to bring that up. I remember at the time that there wasn't a lot of mapping happening. Like there's road maps, there's various things you can rely on, but what's going on in the area, having to look at social media as a tool to help mobilize people and see that engagement was so key that I just had in the back of my mind, where does this then play into like how could mapping be used further? What and I know from an outside perspective, we're always that armchair cartographer of here's
Right.
what I would do in this situation.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
tough.
and we have to be careful about that too, right? Because these folks, the GIS practitioners in the region, they knew, they knew. And I think there's a lot of residual frustration that their voices and their skills in this technology wasn't necessarily heard, or leadership wasn't necessarily aware of it. So there's definitely been some tension there, and we're working to change that. It's kind of we have we've got some plans in place to kind of create uncommon dialogue between our government leadership in the region and these GIS practitioners to help them realize how important this was. But also those GIS practitioners, they live here too, right? Some of their houses were damaged, some of their loved ones were missing, and they're literal heroes up, 24/7 working on trying to advocate for the use of this technology to respond to this. And they were. And, we have to think about that too. These are folks that are also living through this, and, they're heroes in their own right. And I think the next time around, we're going to be better prepared, and their voices will be heard. And I think they'll be able to advocate for the use of that technology much more quickly.
And I think these are moments where like we live through them. It helps to build a passion for wanting to be more involved. I know, having been through various disasters and we've all lived through various events, that it wants me to have a part in it. I feel that desire to, like, how could this be better? How could we reach out to have an impact? I'm wondering, have all of these events played a role in developing your interest and passion surrounding climate action?
Yes, 100%. And I'll tell you kind of a funny story. I don't know what kind of light it's going to put me in, but I think it's worth being honest about it. So yeah, living in Nashville, we kind of take the tornadoes for, they just are what they are. So I didn't necessarily recognize them as related to climate necessarily, although, again, like I said, climate was always in the back of my mind. And when I came to work at Esri, my boss, I love my boss to death, Chris Thomas. Oh my God. And he cracks me up. He really pushes, he's always trying to push me, and push my boundaries. And he knows where my skills are and he knows where my weaknesses are. And he's very good at pushing me in certain directions. And he really has been advocating for me to take on more climate messaging and stories around climate. And I kind of resisted. I was like, no, we need like a climate scientist. No, we've got others here at Esri that are, very good on the climate spaces. And they are, right? Like each one of us at Esri has some kind of responsibility to speak to our industries through that lens. So I was very resistant. and and I think that, I don't know if it frustrated him necessarily, but it probably did. And after Helene, I can't not think about climate
Mhm.
anymore. Like, I have become super passionate, and I've actually become super passionate about it at the local government level.
Okay.
Prior to Helene, I felt very comfortable speaking in kind of the state and federal space, but Helene has just made me hyper passionate about climate action at the local level. And I think the reason why is we had just moved to Asheville, North Carolina.
Mhm.
And when you just move to a place, right, you're kind of getting to know how the local government runs, you're getting to know your neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. And my husband and I had just come from kind of fighting with the city. Our neighborhood has been fighting with the city about a development in our neighborhood. And climate and our city's climate action plan comes up heavily in this conversation. And then, the attitude that the and I don't mean attitude in a negative sense, but kind of the position that the city took was, well, we've got a climate action plan, and like, yeah, we implement it where we can, but is it really that realistic? And it was really frustrating for us. And then when Helene hit, it was like, wow, are they eating their words? Like, what
Mhm.
can we do? Where was that failure? And I'm not the kind of person that wants to sit there and unfairly criticize my government because, again, they're real people, right? And so I'm sitting here going, wow, where did we fail? And where can we improve this? And I look at these climate action plans from all sorts of cities, right? We're looking at how they use GIS. We're telling these case studies about it. So I see all these climate action plans all over the nation, all over the world. And I learned something pretty quick in that a plan doesn't mean anything if you don't actually operationalize it into your day-to-day governance.
Mhm.
And I think that was the critical failure, not just of Asheville, but of other cities. We've
Yep.
got these plans, but I think we're still kind of trying to figure out how do we really implement those plans? What does that mean? What does that look like? And I think we're going to see, I would like to see, I think we will see some changes coming that leverage GIS to do that. So,
Mhm. And I'm wondering, I know there's been a rise in these so-called climate havens, Asheville, North Carolina having been thought of as one of them, that these are areas that are supposed to be less impacted by climate change. They're like the place we want to be in the next few years. Having seen how history has played out, it doesn't seem like Mother Nature wants to respect our ideas surrounding where we want to all live. Um, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts in this? Is that playing a part that we've designated these areas as like they're untouchable, but we still need to plan in those areas?
I don't know who came up with that term, and I would love to meet them and give them some lectures on how climate works. But there is no such thing as a climate haven, and I think that's a ridiculous term. I also don't think that there's a real, yes, of course, from a geographic standpoint, how climate impacts areas will be different, right? And we do know that there are uh, I think they're kind of characterized really as accelerations of climate change or
Mhm.
heating at certain areas, et cetera, et cetera. But there's all these other things that climate impacts. And it's not just that there's warming, it's also that there's more extreme weather, and that could be extreme cold, right? Which is also deadly.
Mhm.
It could be changes in our weather patterns. So, rain falling in a shorter amount of time frame and more intensely. It has significant changes on the ground, right? So, like here in the Appalachian Mountains, we get a lot of rain. We're used to rain, but it's usually kind of over long seasons, kind of
Mhm.
drizzly, light rains, some storms, et cetera, et cetera. And the soil is able to absorb that. And we have these really rich, beautiful, lush forests that Smoky Mountains are known for. In fact, there's like a chemical that is expelled by the trees that is behind the blue haze that the Smokies are known for. When we look at climate change and the idea of the Appalachians being a climate haven, well, we're seeing more intense rainfall and in these kind of shorter spurts. And there's erosion that happens with that. There's landslides. There's these dry periods. There are significant changes on the landscape. And when you think about the biodiversity on the ground, salamanders, right? And the fish in our streams and the sedimentation and the hellbender. The hellbender is our iconic Appalachian salamander, the largest salamander in the world. I think maybe second largest next to one in China. And these species, our biodiversity is impacted. Our landscapes are absolutely changing. The ecology is changing, and therefore these underlying environmental factors that provide our cities with the ability to thrive and have clean water and clean air, et cetera, those are changing too. And we're struggling to figure out how to adjust to that. Um, so yeah, the idea of a climate haven, I want to throw that term out the window. I swear,
Mhm.
whenever I hear it, I just want to scream. It's ridiculous. There's no such thing.
Well, I'm sorry to bring it up, but I figured it was one of those topics worth discussing because it does go out there.
It's worth discussing, and it's worth saying that we can know at a local level what the impacts of climate change will be. We can predict that. Those are free data sets that people can go and look at in ArcGIS Living Atlas, and they can project it out, and they can project it out under different scenarios. And you don't have to be a climate scientist to do that. These things are now much more accessible than they used to be. So, yeah, I encourage everyone to go check that out and understand what is your climate going to look like, and start planning for that.
Mhm. And acknowledging that the data's out there, we can start exploring how does data play a part into what our climate's going to look like, hopefully then playing a part into what climate action plans are going to look like. What are some of those common gaps or weaknesses that you've seen in how climate action plans play out, knowing that you've looked at a few different ones?
Yes. So I see a lot of fantastic climate action plans. They're great. They're, I'll see ones where their philosophy is tied to more ecological consequences, or it's tied to wildfire hazards, or it's tied to economic issues. I've seen the whole gamut, right? And they all are valid. However, if we are not taking those climate action plans and then tying them back to the day to day work of, let's say, our planning department or our capital improvement projects that have to be done in a city or our transportation needs or whatever, then what are we doing with those climate action plans? We've got to figure that part out. That's the biggest weakness.
Mhm.
And I think a big player in this is going to be community planners. They are really, through zoning policies, they're the ones that are uh, really influencing how we use our land in our cities. And we talk about, think globally, act locally. Well, I think we need to get our climate plan, our community planners involved in this much more intimately and look at those zoning and consider that. Buffers, right, on things like wetlands, but also how do we think about green space? I think one of the arguments when we were fighting this development in our neighborhood is that the green space itself was innately valuable for the ecological services it provides. It has a wetland on it, it slows flooding, it's more upstream in the watershed, so it's capturing water and slowing flooding downstream. But it wasn't necessarily valuable from like a conservation standpoint. It didn't have biodiversity on it. And it was really frustrating to try and get the more conservation minded nonprofits to help advocate for this cause, because they're like, well, there's nothing really of like conservation value on the property. It's like old farmland and a bunch of fescue. Like, y'all, let's have some vision.
Yeah.
There's more to this than just that, and that's important, of course. But we've got to start thinking about this in the context of the holistic landscape of our city. If we're putting in stormwater features on one parcel and we're requiring that, but we're completely on the other side of the city ignoring those things, then they cancel each other out. We've got to stick to those plans, and we've got to look at those maps and use that data to help us make decisions when we're going to our planning and zoning committee every month, right? And making decisions about these things. Got to stick to it. So there's real ways that we need to operationalize these things into our day to day.
And I think it's interesting to bring up that we need that more holistic view, and that structures are a little rigid at times in government and corporations, whatever it is, that there isn't a lot of intersectional work happening between departments. But when we're looking at things like a climate action plan or community engagement plans, even regardless of what it is, there's always more than one team that's tasked with actually overseeing the work, but maybe only one team is in charge of designing it. That if we can break down some of those walls a little bit, see more cross-departmental work, maybe we can get a little bit more progress. But that's easier said than done, I know.
No, it's true, and I think there's real power of GIS there as well. So when I think about what does the perfect government look like, I know not to think about utopia as something that's real, but I think there is something valid in the thought exercise of thinking about what does GIS look like for bridging the gaps between these different entities inside a government. There's very real reasons why our governments have pretty much universally evolved to work in these silos, right? People have specialized uh, things that they need to get done. They're experts in those things and they do that, right? But something about GIS, and modern GIS especially, is that because we're using geography as our baseline, we can layer information on top of each other and understand how that interrelates. So I can work in my silo, right? I can be doing my transportation planning. I can be choosing the next formula for the asphalt we're going to put on the roads, but I can look at a map and I can say, okay, these are the roads that I've got to repair, but this has got to last for 10 or 20 years. What does that climate look like 10 or 20 years out? And do I need to change my formula to adjust for increased temperatures and be more resilient to that? So that's one example of bringing climate scientists into those kinds of decision makings with a Department of Transportation. Another is like the stormwater, right? Okay, how much impervious surface are we beginning to accumulate or predicting to accumulate through much needed affordable housing developments in these certain areas? Can we predict what that looks like? And if we play with that in our environmental digital twin inside GIS and adjust these different things, can we predict what the water flow will look like the next time we have some kind of rain event? And we can. That's all very possible, right? Those things are at our fingertips, and governments already own that technology. That's all GIS technology. And so I think there's real opportunity here to break down those silos while still retaining that very necessary specialization through the lens of GIS.
Hmm. I think acknowledging that there's a lot of potential for the bridging of bringing in GIS to different areas and into climate action plans. What are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen in integrating GIS into climate action plans, and how can we look at overcoming them?
So right now I see a lot of governments will hire a third party, which makes sense, to help them craft their climate action plan. And really, the use of GIS begins with that RFP. If a government is going to craft an RFP for a climate action plan and a third party is going to come in, I really encourage governments to start thinking about writing in GIS deliverables as a requirement for those RFPs. Most climate action plans that I see are PDFs that get thrown online, and they're full of fantastic data. And ironically, they're full of maps, but they're full of static maps
Mhm.
that they've exported out into this embedded report. That data is much better utilized as something like a dashboard or delivered through feature services that government that can then utilize in their own kinds of building of their own dashboards or experience builders, right? We really need to reframe and rethink how that information and how that report is delivered. And it needs to be those dynamic geospatial layers. And we've got some fantastic business partners that do this, like Fernleaf. Fernleaf actually is here in Asheville, and they have a fantastic climate action plan that they've delivered to the city of Asheville, and those layers are online. So the next step then, right? So Fernleaf's done it right. They're delivering that spatially, but then it requires the political will of the government itself to then leverage that data or leverage that application that's delivered to them. And I think that's where we stopped short in Asheville. We weren't taking those information products that Fernleaf delivered to us and integrated them into a decision making tool for folks like our Planning and Zoning Commission, folks like our DOT, our capital improvement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They should be able to have that at their fingertips on their desk at all times, pull it up and pull in any other layers they need. The proposed development design, the new bus stop, whatever it is. They should be able to see that. And there's nothing technologically preventing them from doing it. It's our political will, it's the awareness, and it's investing in the human resources to be able to really tackle that.
Mhm.
There's some fantastic GIS practitioners inside our governments here regionally, but they're kind of siloed too, and they are not seen as GIS practitioners first necessarily. And so they're not being given the support and the resources necessary to take their training further and to be able to support their government in that way. They're not necessarily elevated. So we need to be doing that for sure.
Okay. And acknowledging that there's great technology there, there's practitioners. I'm wondering, how do we see this going further? Does GIS technology need to evolve further to support climate adaptation and mitigation efforts in the next 5 to 10 years? Is GeoAI the answer? What does the future look like?
So, yes, GeoAI is the answer, but there's a lot of caveats to that. So, I think the first caveat is that GeoAI has been around for a long time, right? And this idea of even environmental digital twins, I threw that term in earlier. I wanted to circle back to it. It's also been around for a really long time. I would venture to say nearly 50 years of Esri's existence. We've been talking about these concepts. They may have had different terms at the time, right? But the technology is definitely continuing to evolve. And I see this happening a couple of different ways. There's both GeoAI and probably the sense that a lot of us have experienced, right? Where we're modeling some kind of scenario on our desktop GIS, and we're publishing the results of that scenario out to our web GIS, and we're creating a dashboard or whatever it is to help communicate and tell the story of those results. So that's one thing, and that's definitely evolving. And I would say the way it's evolving is through speed and scale. So, really processing, probably on that side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing some amazing examples of GeoAI being used to model wetlands, in just a matter of weeks across entire states with
Wow.
super high confidence, right? So we can start asking fascinating questions around the role of wetlands and absorbing things like floods. So we're seeing that. But the other role that I think GeoAI is going to take on is helping decision makers and the public understand and use this information more readily. So things like large language models and natural language processing, being able to have a conversation with my computer and ask it questions about these data sets and get a result back. So I'm going to go back to that, put the DOT hat on, right? If I'm a transportation planner and I've never used GIS in my life, then we can now leverage AI to remove some of that learning curve and allow that planner to ask the question, hey, given what the climate might look like in 10 years, what should my formula request be for the next asphalt application we're going to put on this road? And it's going to have an answer. Now, I think governments, I love this idea. And if it's what excites people to start thinking about this, then great. But I think we're in a space right now where really understanding the role of good, high quality data and it's the necessity for high quality data and high quality metadata in order to have a functioning, trustworthy AI, it's critical. And so I think this excitement around AI is starting to really highlight that discussion in a way that I don't think we've had anything that exciting to be able to talk about something that boring before.
Great
But
point.
it's so important.
And acknowledging that there is a place, but there still needs to be people in the mix here. What advice would you give to governments, organizations, or individuals that are looking to incorporate GIS into their climate action plans?
So my advice is to make sure that you aren't just thinking about this as a technological problem. This isn't just something that you throw on your CIO or your GIO's lap. It's something that you need to look at all of your business processes across all of your government, right? And think about your strategy. Think about your needs and your gaps and your challenges, and then leave it to the technologists to help translate that into technology solutions. And I think that's my advice for non-GIS practitioners. And then my advice for GIS practitioners is the opposite, right? Or not really the opposite, but we're so used to talking about technology and we know we're really passionate about it.
Mhm.
And so we make the mistake of kind of starting with that. But if we're going to try and advocate for the use of this technology from a technology standpoint to a government leader, well, we've already lost them. We have to advocate for it from their perspective, from the challenges that our city has. And I think that's when I've seen the most successful advocacy. And geospatial strategy, I think, is really key. Having an engagement where you really take a geospatial strategy as seriously as you would take development of a climate action plan.
Okay. I think that's good advice to move forward on, that everything does require some effort. We do need to take that care in planning. Thinking back to your comment about we need to think global, act local, and acknowledging that communities and organizations are going to have some components that are unique to them. What are key things that people should consider when drafting an effective climate action plan?
Well, I think with any plan, you have to tie it to those unique issues that you are experiencing, right? And so your first thing is to kind of understand what's going on. And there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of GIS out there that helps folks understand what is the situation at hand that we're looking at right now and into the future. That understanding is going to inform where you have challenges and also where you have opportunity, right? This isn't all doom and gloom. There's a ton of opportunity that communities have when thinking about how they move forward with mitigation and resiliency and adaptation. So that needs to kind of inform your plan. But again, that weakest part is that action. And if we're delivering these plans through geospatial technology, we have a ton of opportunity to very quickly take action on that. But if we don't, if they're that PDF that's sitting on the shelf that nobody reads and none of your public really clicks on, it certainly doesn't read, then we're missing out on a ton of opportunity. We're missing out on the opportunity to allow the public to start engaging and taking their own actions. We're missing out on the opportunity to break down those silos across government. We're missing out on the opportunity to leverage things like GeoAI and more predictive technologies. We're missing out on a lot. So yeah, the taking action part is the biggest next step. And if we aren't leveraging geospatial technology to craft the plan in the first place, we're really handicapping ourselves on that ability to take action.
Okay. And more importantly, when we're talking about these plans, there's a lot of detail, but getting started can be a hard step of knowing where to go. What would you recommend for communities or organizations looking to begin their process on developing a climate action plan?
I would recommend that they open up their browser right now and they type in Esri climate. We have a wealth of resources, and we've actually crafted. We've got a hub page around this that helps walk people through climate resiliency and how to get started. And it's kind of at all levels, right? There's a high level one, but then for the geospatial technologists, there are tutorials that we've crafted that take them through the whole understand, plan, and act cycle. We have a climate action MOOC actually that's going on right now. My husband just finished it, and he is a geospatial technologist, and he was like, I learned so much on that, right? He felt really empowered to be able to take that further. So we have a plethora of resources. So yes, open up that browser, search for Esri Climate. We have so many resources. I'm always posting stories and case studies as well. And then I think regionally too, we have a lot of opportunity in our own communities to have our own meetups and create our own uncommon dialogue between spatial technologists and our governments. And I think we just need to get them going. So yeah, we should feel really empowered to take action and start talking about this and finding your advocates, right? It may just be one person inside your government right now that cares to listen to you. That's fine. Start with that one person. It's never gonna, well, maybe it will, but it's almost never gonna start with a big splash, right? So don't be discouraged.
And this does tie into our next question very well, as we covered some already, but where can listeners learn more about this topic and get started with GIS for climate action? We've got Esri resources. Is there anything else you'd recommend? Any books to get started or really revolutionize the thought process?
Whew, well,
No.
yeah, I do read a lot of books on this topic, but admittedly, they're more kind of speculative fiction, which can go down the doom and gloom cycle. So I won't necessarily recommend that. But we do have the Esri bookstore, of course. We've got, I know that Jack just published his book about the power of where, and we have some climate resources on there as well. Dawn Wright, our chief scientist, is constantly posting about climate resources. So make sure that you're following her on LinkedIn. And then also on our climate pages on the website, you can, there's a tab on the right to stay updated. You can put your email in and you can get our newsletters about this. And they're full of case studies. So they're your peers. It's not just new cool tech, although we throw that in too for those that like it. But it's a lot of case studies. It's a lot of peer work to help you understand what cities are doing what, who's been successful, and how you can model yourself off of their success.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure to link everything we're talking about in our show notes. That does bring us to the end of our questions. And I want to say, I
Ew.
know, I know. Thank you, Sunny, for joining us. Hopefully you've had a good time. I've enjoyed us discussing a topic that we don't really get to dig in this deep all the time on.
Yeah, we don't. And it's been really enjoyable. I like talking about this because, I'm not a climate scientist, right? I'm a citizen. And as a citizen, I think we bring a different perspective that sometimes our climate scientists aren't able to necessarily bring. But yeah, I've appreciated the opportunity, Michelle. Thanks.
Fantastic. And if today's conversation has shown us anything, it's that maps are more than just points and polygons. They're powerful tools for action. Whether it's preparing for the next big storm or planning long term climate strategies, GIS is helping us see the bigger picture and make smarter decisions. A huge thank you again to Sunny Fleming for sharing her insights and helping us explore how technology can drive real climate solutions. And to you, our listeners, as always, what role will you play in shaping a more resilient future? Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking geographically.